I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you. I'd like to call the meeting to order of the Carbon Dioxide Transit and Storage Advisory Committee. I guess the first item of the agenda would be to approve the minutes of November 21st and 28th, and I would like to have those omitted. I know that at this particular time, they are uploaded but have not been viewed yet as far as the public is concerned. So I guess with that in mind, to approve the agenda with items 2 and 3 to be deleted. Do I have a motion for that?
So moved.
Do I have a second? Motion by Aaron, second by Scott, or Anderson. Let's go ahead and call the roll, please.
Commissioner Aaron's,
Yes.
Anderson,
Yes.
Nordsey,
Yes.
Ventura,
Yes.
Scott,
Yes.
Sweeter,
Yes.
Commissioner Aaron. I'm sorry, Commissioner Gibbon.
Yes. The other thing I'd like to remind people today, we have quite a full agenda, so I think it's important that we stay on task. We do a better job as well as if we stay on task. And so the first item under item number 1, staff comparison, proposed ordinances submitted. I know Toby from Planning and Zoning, you're here on that, so let's begin with that, please.
Sure. I'll pull up the page here. Sorry. So what was placed in the committee documents, this is on the official web page of the committee. Staff did put together a comparison of the submitted ordinances that have been submitted to the county to date. As a reminder, there have been 3 ordinances that have been submitted through the Planning and Zoning Office as what we'll call zoning text amendments. And the county historically has allowed citizens to submit proposed ordinances to amend the zoning regulations. The first 2, as noted, were submitted by Anthony Ventura, and those were given rezone numbers associated with application numbers. The third one's been submitted by Carla Lems, that has not been assigned for a public hearing or for application assignment. And the last one would have been submitted by Commissioner Aaron's, and that was submitted to the Board of Commissioners for remand. There was no action taken on that. So I won't go into too much depth in this unless you have specific questions. Hopefully everyone has a chance to review this on the webpage. Again, because this is a short-term committee, there won't be a formal civic clerk item for this. So we don't have like the typical Board of Commissioners Planning Commission agendas where you can link those documents and things. You have to go to the specific webpage to look at this. But essentially, staff looked at the 2 main issues from a land use issue, which would be the setbacks, and then the land uses. What zoning districts are these allowed, and what type of a use are they allowed as? And so it's pretty self-explanatory with that. As you can see, the ordinances, the Anthony Ventura and the Joel Aaron's ordinances are very similar, minus the setback comparisons. All ordinances primarily look at the A1 and the RC zoning districts. The ordinance that was submitted by Carla Lems is a unique ordinance. That doesn't specifically amend the zoning regulations. That adds essentially a chapter to the county code of ordinances. And so there is no really called out for zoning district or use within there, just a setback. Each has varying setbacks for the different types of uses. It may look that some of the church schools and some of those businesses aren't, that there wasn't a setback for those, but there was different definitions for those high consequence areas, small businesses, those different types of things. And then there is, what is also important is how the setbacks are measured. So primarily, all of the ordinances would require a setback from the property line, lot line. But specifically, Commissioner Aaron's would be from the structure, which is more so common with the rest of the setbacks that the county currently has within the zoning regulations would be from structure, not property line. As far as the different types of land uses, again, A1, RC would be the predominant ones. Commissioner Aaron's also suggested putting in the I-1 zoning district. And then unique about the different types of uses that are proposed. So for the Commissioner Aaron's ordinance would be a permissive use, which would be a by right use, as long as they meet the standards or conditions that are there. Mr. Ventura's ordinances would be a permitted special use. And I think, that's something that as staff presented these ordinances to the Planning Commission, from a staff perspective, I think there was some confusion to that from the public as well, is that a permitted special use does not create a hard setback. A permitted special use creates a minimum setback, but the setback can be waived. And so you could have a 2,500-foot setback under a permitted special use, but it could be flipped to a conditional use, in which case there would be no setback. So the setback would be approved by the Planning Commission. Each of them did have a unique waiver process. The Carl Lems ordinance did not. It does have a requirement that it can't be built on a Century Farm or historical site, but that can be not necessarily waived, but it can be allowed if the landowner agrees to do such. With that, I know we have a meaty agenda today. Hopefully you've had a chance to review this. It's pretty self-explanatory. We'll get into the ordinances next, the first two ordinances that Mr. Ventura submitted. Otherwise, I'll take any comments that the chair or the board has at this time. So,
Are there any questions from those of you on the committee for Mr. Brown?
Mr. Chair.
Yes.
Toby, thank you very much for doing this. I know as one of the instigators behind this extra work effort, and thank you. This is exactly what I was looking for.
okay. And again, this is a work in progress. If there's additional items that you want to, each ordinance has some substance type issues as far as different types of requirements. We can add those onto the chart, but from a land use perspective, these are the most important things that really is of importance from a land use perspective. So,
Any other questions for Toby?
Toby, it was, as mentioned at the last meeting, that there were some differences with regard to definitions. Can you speak to the different definitions that are used in the various proposals?
sure.
And I had a question on that regard too. You mentioned from property line to lot line, correct? Maybe some people here that might not quite understand that.
Sure. So the first question would be is the different definitions. So each ordinance, the first Ventura ordinance has a definition for carbon dioxide. And I'm not going to regurgitate what that is, but we do have the ordinances available here. And that would be this one there. Oh, not staff report. This one. So this was a primary definition. So the first ordinance from Mr. Ventura had carbon dioxide pipeline defined as this. And then the second one would have been 31. So the second one that Mr. Ventura submitted, which I would say is loosely based on Minnehaha County, went a different route for carbon dioxide, went with hazardous liquid pipelines, and so defined those within those definitions. However, it does also address the definition in state statute, which is under STCL 4941B2 for carbon dioxide pipelines. And then the third one, this one. So this was one that was submitted by Carl Lems. This definition defines CO2 pipeline as this here. Now I grab something real quick. Go here. So I know Mr. Anderson asked about this last week, is the definition that the state of South Dakota uses for carbon dioxide, which would be under 4941B2. So carbon dioxide is a fluid that consists of more than 90% carbon dioxide molecules compressed in a supercritical state. And then this would be the federal statute. As you can see, it's the same definition. So the state of South Dakota's definition copied the federal definition. This federal definition is what Commissioner Aaron's has in his ordinance for carbon dioxide. So that would be the primary differences between those.
Toby, do you have an opinion? What do you feel is the right one?
Oh, that's up to committee, yeah. Well, you're well aware as a planning commission, we struggle with definitions on a monthly basis. So the needs for definitions are critically important. As I said at the first meeting, is that the first step should always be the definitions. So, you know, as a land use planner, I believe in not recreating the wheel.
Right?
It's much easier to just follow what the state and the feds have as far as that. But again, you know, that's up to the board, so.
Toby, is there any harm in, obviously it's a pipeline and it goes not only across multiple states, but even more counties. Is there harm if this pipeline, which is an interstate project, if counties are using different definitions of this as it goes through multiple states and multiple counties?
You know, I would answer that question, Commissioner, that all definitions and zoning ordinances are different.
Yeah.
There is a complication when it is an interstate project, though. But with that, I would say that every ordinance has a different definition for setbacks and for those. so.
I got a question for you.
Yep.
Have you read this letter from PHMSA that explains the role of the state, federal government, local government control?
Yes.
So do you think the local government has a right to make a decision on a setback?
I'll defer that to legal.
Do you think they have a right to decide where the pipeline goes?
I'll defer to legal.
So will legal answer that question?
Definitions right now.
Yeah, let's,
We've got an agenda item
Yeah.
to ask those
Yeah.
questions of legal
Yeah.
later on.
I know that
We'll just have to put a pin in it.
Toby made mention of Mr. Ventura's and Mr. Aaron's comparisons. I know Mrs. Lems isn't here, but would either one of you, over a short period of time here, I don't know, want to make a comment? I know we have an agenda to follow, but is there any specific, before we move on to item number 3? But
You want to go first?
What are you looking for, Commissioner?
I'm just, I know he made mention of 2 plans, I believe it was, so, and mentioned your name and Mr. Ventura's. So I was just wondering if you wanted to follow up with any comment.
Yeah, I don't have any follow-up to the
Okay.
definitions
Okay.
issue. I think he answered it for the committee.
All right, thank you. All right.
But you think, Toby, as far as definitions go, either one of the definitions in those ordinances would be suffice?
of the submitted ordinances? Or
Or do you see any glaring problems with any of them?
Well, I think staff's gonna have to interpret it, whatever is adopted. It's much simpler to say it aligns with what the state PUC follows than it
Yep.
would be anything, so, yeah.
Okay.
Okay. Mr. Anderson?
Thank you, Chair. I guess I would just mention that old language has generally been tested and settled. New language is always going to be subject to further litigation. What does this mean or what does this not mean? And so I would encourage us to follow state statutes, state definitions as much as possible, regardless of the plan or the other provisions.
Thank you.
Well, and I think we need to be very clear that the state has their role, the county and the townships have their role, the federal government has their role, and everybody needs to stay in their lane. So this, you know, like I said, Lincoln County is run by commissioners. If they don't want to be commissioners, then let's be run by the state. But that's the reason why we have commissioners, is to make regulations and good development for the people.
Toby, do the pipelines have to follow federal law?
I'll defer to legal.
Okay, I'll ask that series of questions to council.
What was your comment, Toby?
I'll defer to legal, yeah.
Any other questions or comments? And again, like I've reminded you, the last 2 meetings.
Toby, I have another
We are
question.
making a recommendation.
Do the
of course, for
pipelines
our
have to
commission. Just a
defer-
second, Mr. Ventura. So let's keep that in mind. We're making a recommendation, so go ahead.
Do the pipelines have to defer to the county regulations and standards and even the comprehensive plan?
Well, I defer to legal, but I think the PUC has stated that publicly, yes.
Okay, are we ready to move on to item 3?
Like two, right?
Excuse me. Yeah, we did item 2, correct?
Have you done your staff report on that?
Nope, we can do number 2
Okay,
next.
all right, then we'll go ahead. I'm going to call. We'll go ahead and move on to item 2.
Yep. So at the last meeting, the board discussed that they wanted to go into specific review of the 2 ordinances that were submitted by Mr. Ventura. And so I've included the staff reports on the agenda. I'll go through some real quick kind of nuts and bolts analysis of it. In conjunction with, I won't go through the staff report specifically. What I would talk about is that Mr. Ventura submitted the first ordinance on December 19th to the Planning and Zoning Office. That was scheduled for a public hearing in February before the Planning Commission. That specific ordinance, as I mentioned, back there. So this specific ordinance, again, this was a citizen-initiated amendment, and so staff didn't engage really in any assistance with the ordinance, other than there was some form things that we went through with the applicant, primarily because of anything that we would have involved in, then it would have become our ordinance, where then it would have taken away the rights to the applicant to have a citizen-initiated ordinance. As you can see, again, that the applicant identified in this first ordinance that carbon dioxide pipeline would be defined as follows. And then a landowner, as defined with the CDP, would be defined as follows. The use carbon dioxide pipeline was added to a permitted special use in the A1 and the RC Recreation Conservation District. And again, I would stress this from staff's perspective, that I think there's a great misunderstanding of what a permitted special use is. It's not a hard setback. It can be overridden with a conditional use permit. So it could be 5 miles, but it doesn't matter, because the applicant could apply for a conditional use permit and override that permitted special use. And so a couple other little items that I think that staff looked at here was, there was, in all 3 ordinances, there's what I'll call some enabling type legislation, which says why we can do what we do and those different types of things. Deferred to legal on those requirements as well. And then there was some language as far as the setbacks. And so for this particular ordinance, the applicant identified that they wanted a 2,500 setback from a dwelling in an eligible building site. And I won't get into too much on the eligible building site. What I would say is that when it was recommended by the Planning Commission, they did remove that provision. And I know and I would say that within the last 2 years, building eligibility has become quite a common thing in the county that nobody really knew about before. They become a high commodity in the county. And essentially what it was is in 1995, the county board identified that prior to 1995, all you had to do was have possession of 1 acre of property. You could come into planning and zoning, we would issue a building permit for a single-family dwelling. Multifamily, 3-family, duplexes are not allowed in Lincoln County, in the unincorporated area, just single-family dwellings. And so at that time in 1995, the county envisioned that we've got a potential problem growing. We had a number of subdivisions that were unplanned, undeveloped, and had issues. And so identified that something that Minnehaha County was doing, something that started over in really Minnesota counties, was this what we call building eligibility. And so it's a building right, 1 per quarter. So essentially, generally, in the county, every quarter has the right to build a single-family dwelling on it. And I say generally because it's a complicated process, because also in 1995, the county said we don't want to take away the rights of people that already platted property. So in between, I think it was July and October, what happened in the county was everybody that knew about this went out and platted lots all over the county. And so with that, we had to give them the right that, so everyone will call me all the time and say, well, there's more than 1 house per quarter in my area. True, but that's because they were lots of record. And so that's the next term that really established was a lots of record. But the challenge with an eligible building site or building eligibility is they're not assigned. They're just essentially 1 per quarter. They're floating. They could be here, they could be this part of the, and a quarter is 40 acres for those of you that don't know that. But the challenge with it is that we don't know where it is, and that's good. The landowner gets to decide where they want to put the house, and that could be on 4 different areas. It could be on 3 different roads. It could be in different areas.
Toby,
And so, yep.
I have a question for you. So if you were an applicant under this proposed statute or ordinance, how would you know where the eligibility is in order to determine where you should route your pipeline if the eligibilities are floating?
You
And
would,
not-
yeah, you wouldn't.
You don't?
No,
No.
you would have to, there is no map of the eligible building sites.
So does that propose issues with regard to the planning and zoning process?
And just so I'm just gonna interrupt, Commissioner Aaron's, and that's the reason we took it out at Planning Commission, because it was undefinable at the time and probably never will be completely defined, and so that's why it was removed.
I also want to make a point, though, that if a developer's coming in, they know those eligibilities can be built. It would be in their best interest to deal with the landowners first. That is a private commodity decision between the two parties.
We get up to 5 calls a day. I don't believe the landowners know they exist either, most of the time, to be honest with you. Some do, most don't. And I would say up till 2 years ago, they were selling for $25,000. They're selling for $500,000 just for the floating right to build on property in Lincoln County. So it's a challenge. But our record is, and I've said this publicly before, is our record is the tax books from 1995. They're green books. We look up every single one that calls us in and goes through that process. We also have to look through records. The other issue with building eligibility is they can be transferred, they can be moved. And that happens quite a bit in the county, so.
Infinitely.
Yeah.
As long as it's contiguous, if you want to explain that, yeah.
It can
But you can
take-
see why
Yeah.
it made it really difficult to keep that in the ordinance, because this is just a moving target and will be for as long as land transfers hand, basically.
Yeah. And then I'll move on from that unless there's any other questions about that. But, so urban expansion areas, so undefined what that exactly is. In Lincoln County, we do have growth areas of municipalities, and those are the municipalities' growth areas. So the county doesn't have a specific expansion area for what the municipalities have. The only one we really have would be with Sioux Falls, and we do have joint jurisdiction with them, which is a shared boundary for those planning decisions. But along with that is that each of the communities have growth areas that greatly exceed what's allowed by state statute as far as what I'll call platting jurisdiction, which is allowable up to 3 miles. So terms are important, uses are important, so I think it's just consistency. And then small businesses and structures and those different types of things. And I would go off of what Commissioner Aaron's asked about the building eligibilities. We don't necessarily have a record of all the businesses that are in the county as well, too. So in Lincoln County, we do allow minor home occupations within a structure, and that doesn't require any notification of our office, notification of the county. And so there's a number of those that are operating within the county, as well as I think the A1 agricultural district is not just agricultural district. The A1 agricultural district is what I'll call a mixed-use type zoning district. We allow commercial, we allow industrial, and we allow public facilities, which everyone's aware of. And so there's a number of things that are allowed within there, kennels and those different types of things. We wouldn't necessarily define a kennel as per the use as a business, but without a definition for those types of things, it would be complicated for staff to administer. So. It does allow a setback modification, so the Planning and Zoning Commission can increase the setbacks. That's very similar to what the CAFO requirements are. And then it does allow a setback variance based on those criterias. From a standpoint, I think that, and I should address this at the beginning, the staff report that we have for this particular ordinance for the February meeting, I don't think staff went into depth with the specific ordinance. We were working with legal. We were looking at, is this even legally possible to do this type of an ordinance? And so there was many things that we didn't really address in the staff analysis, which is what I'm doing right now with it. But, state law has requirements for what a variance is from the zoning regulations. And so this could be in conflict with essentially what those are. And again, in talking with Mr. Ventura, a lot of this ordinance was compiled from different states and different types of things like that. That's the other thing I would mention, is that when you take things from other states, they have different laws, they have different types of regulations that enable them to do what they need to do. Even you go over to Minnesota, it's completely different state statute than it is in South Dakota. South Dakota is more western state-based, landowner rights, those different types of things. Minnesota is not. Setback waiver, so this allowed a waiver, so if there was, so for instance, if there was a house within the 2,500 feet, I as a landowner could sign off on a waiver to that property. Very similar to what we do have in current ordinance for CAFOs and for wind towers. This would allow it to be waived down to a minimum of 300 feet. That was, when the planning commission recommended approval, they did take off that requirement to allow it to be waived all the way down to 0. And then I'll get back more into this with the conditional use part of it. And so, I guess I'll address it now, is, so the way it would be is if, let's say that an individual had a house within the 2,500 foot setback. They could sign a waiver much like they do with concentrated animal feeding operations in the county right now. But under the concentrated animal feeding operation ordinance in the county doesn't have the right to override that right. Does that make sense? So if they're gonna
The
build.
right for what?
They don't have, the county boards don't have the right to override that right, okay? So if I'm proposing a concentrated animal feeding operation in the county that requires a setback from a landowner because of a conflict with the setbacks, I have to approach the landowner to get a waiver. If I don't get that waiver, the application's not viable for staff to present it to the planning commission for approval. It stops, it doesn't go anywhere. All of these ordinances don't do that. All of these ordinances would basically say, if you can't get the waiver, you apply for a conditional use permit, and we can approve it over the rights of those landowners. And I don't think the public understands that. But I think that's important to look at, because I think that it's not a hard setback. That's the Minnehaha County ordinance, that's the draft ordinance number 2, and that's the draft ordinance number 1. Okay?
Toby, are you allowed under state law to delegate that zoning or that planning and zoning function to an individual landowner like that? I.e. the waiver, is that allowed?
We have.
Well, okay.
Yeah. So I say we have, yep.
So that standard is used in just about every part of the planning and zoning. So if I wanted to build a house, I can go get a variance if it's too close to Jim's house, and he could sign a waiver. So I could build closer. That's in every part of the ordinance in Lincoln County. And so it's not a new formula. It's been there for years, and it's just been the model that we followed. And it's also a way to not say we're banning something, because it gives the opportunity for the company and the landowners to get together and negotiate. And so it's a tool to keep the government out, but it's also letting the PUC understand that it's not being unreasonable, because they have to work with the people. They can't just storm in here and do what they want. And so it's a fair negotiation process.
I have a
So
question. Go ahead.
Yeah,
Go
I don't think that, and to your point, Mr. Ventura, I think what Toby's trying to explain is that, the waiver process, yes, acts the same, but what he's saying is, if I, a landowner, don't sign the waiver from Jim to build a CAFO, inside the setback, then that's it, it's done. I can't come back to the county and they'll give me a conditional use permit and override his ability to give the waiver. What Toby's saying is these ordinances would have allowed that.
Well, I think.
Correct, Toby? Yeah.
I think
So I think that's what he's saying. He isn't saying, he isn't trying to
No, but I
pick
think-
apart the waiver process, but what happens after the waiver, I
Well,
think,
I-
is different from what we're doing currently in a CAFO situation versus what we would have been doing with these ordinances.
Well, and this is a three-step process. And so that's not what's being discussed here. And I want to be very clear that first you go see if you can get it built. If you can't do that, you got to go to a CUP process. If you can't get your waivers, then you have to go in front of the county commission and ask for a variance. And so it's kind of a step process plan. Instead of just nitpicking it piece by piece, we need to be careful.
So a variance under state statute can't be self-inflicted. There's a high standard under state law for a variance. What this is requiring is a conditional use permit. There's not a high standard for a conditional use permit. It would basically be, the applicant couldn't get a waiver, we're gonna override that.
So do you feel in whatever ordinance we put together, I guess what's the lever, what's the path to make it similar to the way we do? If there is a waiver process in there, that if the waivers aren't signed, that it stops it and it doesn't go to a conditional use permit,
Permissive use.
permissive use. Okay.
So, under that statute though, or the ordinance that we're talking about, Toby, just to take it to its logical extreme, is it possible that either an individual and/or a county commission could prevent a interstate pipeline from being constructed? They could just say, nope, we're not gonna allow it here, and it's done.
Could they pass an ordinance? Yes, but would it just end up in court? That's a
Well, I'm
legal
not
question.
asking
Yeah.
that. I'm asking, is that a possibility under this proposed ordinance?
Well, and I think that's hypothetical. I don't think
Second,
anybody
let-
can
let him
answer.
Hold on,
respond.
can you let him answer?
Sure.
Can you restate the question, I guess?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So to take it to its logical extreme conclusion, under this ordinance, is it possible to actually prevent a pipeline from being constructed if the county would say, not grant the permit?
Yeah, it's possible to construct a pipeline that would meet this minimum setback, yes. But it would have to be approved by the board, yes.
Okay.
Did everybody hear that in the audience? No. Okay, say that again, Toby, please.
So I answer the question that would it be possible to, if this ordinance passed and you had a 2,500-foot setback, would it be possible to build a pipeline in Lincoln County that would be closer than 2,500 foot to a house? Yes. And it would be approved by a conditional use permit.
Or waiver, or the waiver process.
Correct,
Correct.
correct.
But if the county chose not to approve the conditional use permit, that would stop the project cold,
Pending litigation, sure,
right?
Or rerouting.
yeah.
Yeah, or rerouting.
Mr. Ventura, did you have some comment?
I just wanted to say that if they don't meet those standards, they can move that line to fit those standards or get new waivers to fit the application. So I think that is kind of misleading. And so we need to be very careful when we're answering questions like that. And once again, I'm not trying to prevent anything from going anywhere or doing anything. I'm just trying to have a fair standard for all landowners. And once again, this is Lincoln County. Thank you.
Yes, that's true that they could move the pipeline. I just, as staff, want to make it abundantly clear, as I did during the planning commission meeting, that this isn't a hard setback.
Right.
So that, and there would be a public hearing where those landowners who didn't sign a waiver could be overridden by the conditional use permit.
Okay.
That's the facts, so.
Are there any other comments or questions for Toby? Or any other comments you'd like to make, Toby?
I'll go through real quickly again. So this was a 22-page ordinance. And I said to Mr. Ventura, a lot of words when we first started this ordinance, so. But, so the mitigation requirements, construction, operational type, reclamation type standards, there's some additional standards other than land use that would be associated with this first ordinance. Requirements that, what I'll call construction type requirements. What I would tell you is that by ordinance in Lincoln County and most building codes, we would not issue a building permit for the pipeline. Anything above ground that's above the 110 or 120, we would. But by ordinance of the county and most building codes, including Sioux Falls, they wouldn't issue a building permit for the pipeline. So we're not going to have any controls over a lot of these things that would be there.
Toby, is the standards that regulate construction of a pipeline governed by the federal government?
PHMSA, yeah, my understanding. Yeah.
And they have their own, do they have their own inspectors and people who take care of that?
Yes, my understanding is it'd be the regional division out of Kansas City that would be inspecting our area.
If we had to hire people to actually be a pipeline inspector, would the county have to spend more money to do that?
Well, there is a requirement in here in this ordinance that we would hire someone to do those, and that would be paid by the pipeline.
Okay. So the applicant
Yeah.
pays for the inspector that inspects them?
It looks to me like it'd be a full-time FTE with the county,
Okay.
so. There's some other things as far as mitigation compliance and those different types of things. A little bit what I would call additional standards from a land use perspective. And then there's some issues with mitigation, repair, and those different types of things. And this, over the years, I think has been problematic in the county, is mostly with CAFOs, is that most of the development, or a lot of the development that occurs in the county occurs off of non-county roads, township roads. And the burden that's placed on those townships is pretty significant. They have limited budgets, they have limited staff, they have limited equipment, those different types of things. But they are a governmental entity. They're not governed by the county, they're governed by themselves and by their constituents. And so we've tried to move away from requiring us to make requirements on them and then make requirements on us. And so they do have their legal entity, they can make the same requirements they can. And so the county, and then in saying that, from the county perspective, the county highway department does have permits and they do have requirements for pipeline bores and those different types of things. And we do have extensive experience with that because of the DAPL pipeline that went through the county. So those were all permitted through the highway department and through the floodplain department. And then there are some decommissioning plan requirements and things like that. Staff did have concerns that this would be, that the state PUC does have requirements for decommissioning and things like that. Want to make sure we're consistent with what those requirements are.
Were they consistent? Did you
Don't
look
know.
into it?
I think the PUC kind of does that on a case-by-case basis with their
Okay.
plans, yeah. Then a county emergency response plan. Again, this would be something that the county does have an emergency department. And so that individual will be responsible for establishing those things. Typically, we don't like to get into the aspect of being involved in that process. A lot of that stuff is between that individual and the various emergency departments that occur in the county.
Toby, is there any other examples in Lincoln County ordinances where planning and zoning has used its authority to implement a emergency response plan?
Not an emergency response plan. When Lifeline existed in the county, there was a requirement that the planning department, the sheriff's department, emergency department, we facilitated. We met once a year with the applicant to review emergency responses. We did staff it, including the planning department staff, the function, and things like that. So there was many things that I think we did that probably could have been handled by one agency over the other. So, yeah.
I do want to make a comment on that real quick. When I went through the ELOP plan in Lincoln County, I think I found multiple deficiencies, and I sent that to the state's attorney and our emergency management director. With the emergency management director, I've never received any comments back. But until those questions are answered, we need to be very cautious on how we move forward here. Thank you.
And then there's some requirements with economic things and stuff like that. My general comment on that is that the second ordinance that the applicant submitted did have what I'll call a confidentiality clause. This particular ordinance did not have a confidentiality clause. Obviously, a lot of that information, much like a lot of things that our department handles, is confidential from a copyright standpoint or from a safety standpoint or emergency standpoint. And so it'd be important that the last item that this ordinance did is it added with our general notification requirement that if there was a conditional use permit, it would be within a 1 mile notification. The other part that I would make up or mention is that legal did have an issue with this ordinance as well as staff did, is that it established the use as a permitted special use, but then it had this provision in there that no CDP could be allowed without a conditional use permit. So in a way, it was a conflict within the ordinance about how it would have been established. But we never really got to that point of kind of getting to that point of addressing that area. So that's a real quick on that first ordinance. And then
Toby?
I'll hit the second one. Yeah.
Toby, just for clarification, so everybody kind of remembers or is brought up to speed, can you just give a quick history then what happened with that ordinance? And then how we stepped into the next one?
So the first ordinance at rezone 0098-2022, that was recommended by the Planning Commission without change, if I'm correct on that one. I have to look again, but
Except for the building eligibility.
yeah, I think the building eligibility one.
Did planning, Mr. Scott,
Yeah.
did the planning commission meet with the state's attorney's office to go over this before you passed it?
No,
Okay.
after. after it was remanded back to us.
Okay.
So, one thing I said at both hearings, if there's something wrong in here, strike it. If they didn't like it, make the changes.
Yeah.
I was very free and open. Was there anybody from the pipeline companies here at the first meeting?
So, one other comment, Commissioner Aaron's. I believe we did ask at that meeting, maybe to go into executive session, but we're advised not to at that point. So it was somewhat confusing. We had some questions that we wanted.
Who advised you not to?
Yeah, I have to go back and watch the meeting, but
It was not on the agenda.
that's it.
Oh, I
Yeah,
see.
Okay.
that's right.
The executive session was not on the agenda.
Yeah.
Yes, just,
You can't hear Mr. Aaron.
oh, okay.
You're free to come up, you're free to come up here and sit in the front row.
Trying to yell, sorry.
Just remind you to use your mic, please.
Trying to save my
Okay.
voice, so, sorry.
Sorry about that, Toby. Yeah, I think it'd be helpful to just give the history and kind of the recap for everybody.
So the February 21st ordinance, if you recall, it was a night of a blizzard as well. So I believe it was a night of blizzard, but we did have a number of citizens in attendance. It was recommended by the planning commission, with the only change being is that the setback could be waived down to 0 instead of the 300 feet. The eligibilities were not addressed at that one.
Could be less. The landowner could request less, right?
Correct. Yep.
And then that particular ordinance did get remanded back to the planning commission, and at that time, the planning commission recommended that a task force be set up, and that was sent back as a recommendation. There was no other changes made to that particular ordinance. And then sometime in May, Mr. Ventura submitted a second ordinance, and again, I say this was loosely based on Minnehaha County's ordinance that they adopted. And so this ordinance specifically, again, established as permitted special uses in the A1 and RC recreation districts, transmission pipeline. This is significantly different from the first one in that it specifically talked about a transmission pipeline, which was defined later. And so that application required that within 7 days of the PUC filing for a transmission pipeline. And again, staff's interpretation with transmission pipeline would be more than just carbon dioxide. That would be oil, that would be everything except natural gas. Natural gas was specifically excluded from the ordinance. And so the application requirements would be submitted along with the routing and all that information. And then there was a clause put in here that any confidential information would not be released. And so typically, with these pipelines and things like that, because of national security, a lot of that information is repressed as far as location, as far as those different types of things.
So Toby, hold on. So the second ordinance that was passed by planning and zoning, that contains that contains this modified transmission pipeline definition?
Yes.
Okay. And so, is that definition based upon the state or federal law?
Not that I'm really familiar with, no.
Okay. And that was, and planning and zoning, you guys did meet with legal counsel on this second ordinance?
No.
Oh. So you didn't
Yes.
meet with them on the second ordinance either? Okay.
Yes, there was
We
an
met with them
exec,
in between.
well, I think there was an executive session on this public
Okay.
hearing.
So this transmission pipeline definition, does that apply to, it applies to every pipeline with the exception of gas,
Natural gas.
natural
Yes.
gas?
Yeah.
So would it apply to water? Like Lincoln County rural water?
I did have, so as you're aware, is that staff does have, prior to the planning commission meetings, we do have what we call an interdepartmental or outside departmental meeting where we do invite rural waters and those. They did have concerns with this proposed ordinance. They said that, again, they're not regulated by PUC currently, but that doesn't mean that down the road they wouldn't be regulated by PUC with some of their actions.
Well, and would this ordinance, would this county ordinance apply to them regardless of PUC action though?
No, because I think
Okay.
primarily talks about that it would have to be an application submitted to the PUC for a
Okay.
transmission pipeline.
All right.
Yep. But like I said, they did have concerns that at some point in time that PUC would roll them under their approval too, so.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
So this established a separation criteria for dwellings, church, or business that actually decreased from 2,500 feet to 2,000 feet. I did ask the applicant, and he said, well, it just decreased it, because the first one. It did add for first, second, and third class municipalities. As you're aware, in South Dakota, we do differentiate municipalities based on their population with different classes. Those different classes reflect on what they're allowed to do under state statute. And this one did include the eligible building sites as well. And this one, again, establishes the measurement from the property line of the particular separation criteria. This does allow a separation criteria for dwellings and businesses. I think it was a drafting error, but probably should add that this would also allow churches, businesses, or churches to also, in public parks and schools, to also waive that. But that wasn't included as part of the heading on this one. And then the setback for reduction municipalities would be by resolution of that municipality. Same types of things with emergency management, things like that, decrease on the road requirements and those different types of things. It did add a fee to the application of $25,000 initial application fee. That's very similar to what Minnehaha County does, except Minnehaha County also has an ongoing fee per pipeline mile associated with it. And then these, I should go back and say, the definitions that were also added, which is somewhat maybe a conflict, is that it added SDCL 41B2, which is the ones that I showed you earlier for carbon dioxide. But then it also added these definitions, which also references the federal regulations and also the state regulations. And then it did do a separability clause. Again, the concern on this particular ordinance was the separation criteria with the waiver. Is that the 2,000 foot, in my opinion, the public would think that that's a hard setback, but per the ordinance, it would not be a hard setback. It could be waived through a conditional use permit by the county as opposed to the individual landowner associated with it. So that's real quick nuts and bolts of those two particular ordinances. If next week you want to talk about the other two ordinances, we can do that as well.
Then will you explain the changes that we made to it?
Yep.
And passed it? I guess what were the changes and how it was, and then, that we made that before we passed it?
So the planning commission recommended approval of this ordinance. They recommended approval with changes. They took off the eligible building sites. They took all the first, second, and third class municipalities and made that a 1 mile setback. It didn't differentiate it on population size. I think that was the only other thing.
Those are the two big ones, yep.
Yeah. Yeah, I think those were the main changes that were made to it.
Toby, which ordinance is this? No,
This is rezone 00/30/2023. Anthony Ventura's ordinance number 2.
June 20th.
Yep.
Yeah, just so that the public,
Yep.
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 Yeah, that was the June 20th ordinance, and then it passed, correct, Toby? Planning Commission?
Yep, and then this was the one that did have a public hearing before the Board of Commissioners, passed, technically did not pass. So
Right. Will you explain that just for everybody?
I'd rather not, but I'll try to explain. So,
I can if you want, but yeah, I'd like you to speak better.
I believe the state statute requires that there would be a three vote to pass.
Majority.
A majority vote to pass the ordinance, yeah.
So even with two commissioners not voting, they still needed the 3 votes, correct?
Correct.
And so it passed 2-1, if I remember
Correct,
right.
but technically
Or,
didn't pass.
but it technically didn't pass.
Yep.
So,
Commissioner,
Commissioner Scott, the question I have is that the planning and zoning meeting where a couple of the members asked for the map to see what the effect would be? And then I think 1 or 2 of them made some comments about them hesitant to want to endorse this or not endorse it because they didn't know where or what effect the ordinance would actually have that they were voting on?
Yeah, so just speaking off my memory, I believe there was 2 planning commission members that voted no on this. And if I remember right, it was for 2 reasons. One, yes, they would like to see a route of the pipeline and how that would look going through the county, basically for municipalities. And then the other thing is one of them for sure, and maybe both, weren't convinced of the setback, that we had enough knowledge and enough information to make a good determination on what the setback from a residence or a municipality would be.
Thank you.
I'll jump in. So there was two other significant changes to that ordinance. The first one was that the setback was reduced from 2,000 to 750 feet.
Yeah.
And from the recollection I have is that was what the Minnehaha County Planning Commission recommended to their Board of Commissioners was 750 feet. The other change that was made is,
Sorry to interrupt.
yep,
750 property line to property line, or 750 structure, or what are the details on that 750?
from what I can tell from the minutes, they didn't change the property line did not change. It would be 750 feet from property line.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's my memory as
And
well.
then the other change was, at that time, staff was concerned that, that this was only allowed within the A1 and RC districts, so the planning commission recommended it be added to all zoning districts.
Yeah.
In hindsight, I guess, that would be sort of a conflict because we're saying we have a business setback, but we're allowing it within a commercial and I1 and I2 district. And then we also have a setback from a residence, we're allowing that in an RR district, a rural residential district, which is all houses. So, that is an important part of this that I don't think that we've talked about enough, is that the most important part of this from a land use perspective is, where's this allowed? And so currently, you could make the argument it's not allowed at all in any zoning district, that particular use. And so from the standpoint is, what zoning district is appropriate for this type of use? The predominant zoning district in Lincoln County is the A1 agricultural zoning district. That's your undeveloped area. The other zoning districts are developed. They have uses within them, businesses, churches, schools, all those different types of things. The other thing that did not get addressed in that ordinance was legal and staff had concerns that you were gonna make the existing pipelines non-conforming uses. So anytime you pass a regulation, it has unintended consequences on existing things that have already gone through the approval process. This particular ordinance would make all of those pipelines minus natural gas pipelines non-conforming uses in the county.
Based on the definition.
Correct.
Yep.
Yeah. So what that means is that essentially if they needed to be rebuilt, or if there was issues with improvements, or if there was issues with emergency-based fixes or those different types of things, they would not be allowed unless in compliance with the ordinance regulations. That did not get addressed with the recommendation, so.
Which is another reason why you probably feel that making sure the definition is correct is very important.
Yeah, yep, yeah, it's critical, yep, so. Like I mentioned previously, is that Mr. Ventura is on the committee. I did talk with him last week if he has anything that he wants to add to these particular ordinances. I just gave you just a staff overview of it. He could go into more depth and intent and specifics about what the ordinance was intended to be, so. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Toby.
Thanks, Toby.
Any other comments by this committee at this stage? Okay, let's move on to item number 3. I guess, Mr. Ventura, just a reminder, we want to stay on task or on time. How much time approximately do you need?
I'm just gonna go through 4 small sheets, small paper.
Okay.
and get towards the-
All right, we'll let you do that. That's very good.
All right, so this is PUC testimony from Navigator. So the first one is Jerry Briggs. He was the Warren County Fire EMS chief. Satarchi was 24 inches in diameter. Now the valves were 9.5 miles apart. So Summit takes the position that CO2 pipelines are no more dangerous than natural gas and oil pipelines. Do you agree with that? And he says, no, all hazardous pipelines are dangerous, but this one difference is the weight of the product, and the CO2 is not going straight up in the atmosphere, it's going to sink. And you'd have to lower the line areas to remain invisible and odorless. You can smell natural gas and it'll dissipate faster. Oil is obvious when you see it, it's more located and predictable. Once out of the pipeline, it is not affected by charging streams like CO2. I am not aware of natural gas rupture affecting persons three or more miles away from the leak of natural rupture site of CO2 as it did in Satartia. The next question they asked him is, based on your experience, education, training, and background, how far away should these CO2 pipelines be placed if they're going to be sited in relation to populated areas? His answer was, just my experience from what I've seen in Yazoo County, a couple miles at least, that's where we stop seeing victims in at least 3 to 3.5 mile range.
And this is in North Dakota, correct, or not?
This is Satartia, Mississippi.
Oh, okay.
And I'm sorry, Mr. Ventura, what was his name again? I'm sorry. Was that
Yes,
the Jerry Briggs?
it was Jerry Briggs, correct.
Okay. And where's he from?
Satartia, he's Warren County, Mississippi Fire Chief EMS.
Warren County, Miss.
Okay. I
Yeah.
thought it was North Dakota. I'm sorry.
He testified there. Testimony of Jack Willingham, EMS dispatch, Satartia, Mississippi. So a quote he said is, I hear everybody talking about this and how it will be run in a non-populated areas. Well, Satartia was a non-populated area, and their lives worth less than people that was a populated area. Is that what we're saying here? And then he said, I urge the PUC carefully to consider the testimony during the hearing in this matter in your declarations. Based on my experience, I do not believe there are conditions that can be placed on these proposed hazardous CO2 pipelines unless there are minimum 1 mile away from any residence or in a place where people regularly gather. Testimony of John Abraham. So he's got multiple degrees, very smart. He's a private consultant for over 60 companies, wide range of engineering topics, particular thermal fluid dynamic sciences and use of CFD modeling, excuse me. So do you have an opinion as to navigator buffer distances in the Heartland Greenway system, plume modeling and buffer overview what is your opinions? And his answer was yes. Based on navigator's modeling, it's likely that not all of navigator's stated buffer differences, including initial routing, design, and operations, emergency response, and public awareness, are underreported, inaccurate, and unreliable for use in major decisions in the commission will make. So I thought that was pretty clear. Testimony of Richard Kipowitz. He's a president of, I'll spell it, it's ACCUFACTINC. He specializes in gas and liquid pipeline investigation, auditing, risk management, siting, construction, design, operation, maintenance, training, SCADA leak detection, management review, emergency response, and regulatory development and compliance. He has consulted for various local, state, and federal agencies, NGOs for the public and pipeline industry, members of pipeline regulation, operation design with particular emphasis on operation on usually sensitive areas and high population density or environmental sensitivity. So his quote was, CO2 transmission pipelines have unique failure dynamics that ruptures may impact significantly greater geothermic areas than hydrocarbon pipelines. In particular, a combination of CO2 phase temperature changes may result in explosive pipe release force that CO2 converts into gas. Moreover, CO2's lack of odor and its invisibility means that it may not be possible for citizens and first responders to determine they are in a hazard area where they're to be harmed, unless they have access to CO2 detection meters. It is important that anyone using such CO2 detection meters assure that such equipment has been properly calibrated, maintained, and the use is properly trained as for their limitations. Once the CO2 pipeline release has been warmed by the surrounding air environment, it travels unseen, influenced by gravity, terrain, and the wind, preferably setting in its low spots, displacing air and providing no warning to persons and animals, or no warnings to persons and animals caught in the invisible release plume. A CO2 pipeline impact may be measured in miles, not feet. This is not likely possible. The CO2 pipeline rushers can release many tons of CO2. The compressed CO2 will expand into gas phase upon pipeline rupture and fill much larger volume than it did inside the pipe. And the CO2 does not disperse quickly because it is heavier than air, and it will tend to allow to flow and settle into low-lying areas, including ravines, valleys, and basements. So I have Bill,
Which
Karen-
one was that?
That was Richard, correct?
That was Krupowitz?
Cooperwoods, yep.
Yeah.
Where was he from again?
He's president of FX Incorporated.
Okay.
And that is a pipeline company or just?
He's a consultant.
Consultant. Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Testimony of Bill Karam. He's Pipeline Safety Trust Executive Director, River Conservancy, U.S. Department of Transportation Hazardous Liquid Pipeline Advisory Committee, Washington Citizens on Pipelines Safety. So the unique physical characteristics of CO2 moved at high pressure through pipelines can cause running ductile fractures upon rupturing. So what you need to understand is, for some reason, a CO2 pipeline has a way, instead of blowing apart like at the seam, it likes to zipper down the line. And so it's a bigger break, a bigger explosion. The appropriate fracture toughness and steel pipe quality is currently unknown to prevent CO2 from leak or ruptures. R&D project findings said they may use to be developed pipe quality standards and strategies for correct placement of failure mitigation measures along these pipelines. The effects of corrosions, dents, cracks, or gouges have not yet been determined on a wide range of steel grades regarding CO2 operation. Odorization strategies have not been identified. Odorization of CO2 is a likely one to be the simplest way to find a leak. There's currently no defined safe distance or plume dispersion model for developing a potential impact area, a PIR, among CO2 pipelines. Without a PIR, it is impossible to establish accurate emergency response safe distances due to asphyxiation potential for CO2 pipelines. This could have deadly consequences. Only once the appropriate PIR for CO2 pipelines has been established can PHMSA assess the effectiveness and integrity of management procedures. Considering the scope of this project and directive to look at the CO2 as both a gas and a liquid, it is clear that PHMSA is concerned not only with the under-regulation of CO2 pipelines, but with also the current lack of thermal knowledge which is needed to create appropriate standards and minimum safety requirements. Thank you.
Tony, my understanding, it can be transported in three different ways, right? A liquid, a gas, and then kind of a partial liquid gas.
Supercritical.
So there's three possible ways.
Correct.
Any of these that did supposedly leak, were they in the gas form, liquid form, or
Usually
the
it's,
one, I guess the one.
usually it's going to be in a gas or supercritical form. Once it
I don't know,
releases, it
just
converts
why
to
I'm
gas.
Are there any questions for Mr. Ventura by the committee or comments?
Mr. Chair, I have one. We always talk about the Mississippi rupture. Has there been any other instances of a pipeline or CO2 pipeline rupture of the more than 5,000 miles that are in this country?
I'm not aware of that, but maybe some other member
I
of
wanted
the
Mr.
committee.
Ventura, I wondered if he knew.
I believe there's leaks in every pipeline. It just depends on the size of the leak or if it
But
gets
I
reported.
referenced rupture, not leak. Because that's what everybody wants to talk about is rupture. Every line leaks, but rupture. How many other ruptures do we know about in this country?
Well, that's the question, is how many get reported?
Okay.
If they're of that significance, I think you would see it and it would be reported, so. I just want to put that in reference that, I'm not saying lines aren't going to break and leak, but we all talk about one of a pipeline that was built 20 years ago.
And I think you're right, but there's a difference between a natural gas pipeline, a petroleum pipeline, and a CO2 form gas pipeline. And we have to distinguish that even by federal law.
Mr. Ventura, question. So in the Satartia, Mississippi incident, that was not just a CO2 pipeline, correct? There were other was there another chemical inside the pipeline?
Do you just want to see what chemical it is?
Well, I'm asking you, was there?
Yeah, and just an odorant, just like put in natural gas or any other thing that's close to your house, which is hydrogen sulfide, smells like egg. And it's an easy way to detect things, and it's a safer way to detect things than a clear gas that you can't see, you can't taste, and you can't smell. It's released to the public.
Did in the 162-page PHMSA report that did the investigation, isn't it true that they attributed most of the effects on the people to the presence of hydrogen sulfide?
I think some of that is misleading, and I think the second thing is they don't, especially PHMSA, talks about reports to OSHA, which would be workers, not citizens, and so I think a lot of their reports are not fully complete. And so I think when you take in the studies and things like that, sometimes those are rushed and not done properly.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Any other questions or comments for Mr. Ventura? If not, let's go on to item number 4. And good information there, Mr. Ventura, and thank you very much, and you did that within 12 minutes, so very good. Thank you very much. I guess with that in mind, I would remind, moving on to number 4, presentation on pipeline design. I would ask the same thing, please, that give us the information, but remember, we're on a very closed, tight line here.
Yes, of course, thank you. So I have some poster.
Please state your name
Oh,
and
sorry.
address and where you're from and so on and so forth, please.
My name is Brent Neese. I'm a project manager with Summit Carbon Solutions. So currently living in Ames, Iowa, working out of the corporate office.
Okay, thank you.
So I do have a couple poster boards. I'm only going to go over 3 of them just from a timing perspective. I could share my screen if you think that is more appropriate, just so we can see it.
Yeah,
But
if you could do that.
I just had both. I wanted to give the option.
Either is fine. I guess it's your presentation.
Okay. So let me set this up real fast.
Carter, do you want to see if,
I got my laptop with me if I can.
That's not a touch screen, that's controlled by what's on that screen.
There we go.
there we are. Okay, good enough.
So like I said, I'll try to keep this pretty brief. My goal is to go over just some things that we might not be as well aware of. You know, we talk about PHMSA regulations a lot, but what I'd like to go over is some of the background information that we might not always know about that the pipeline company is doing. What I want to go over is not specific to CO2 pipelines. These are industry-wide standards. Things that I'll share today are, you know, things from the initial pipeline routing, what a company's looking at during the initial pipeline design, what is continuously happening in this iterative process. And the last thing I really want to talk about is the integrity management plan that each company is using to establish a baseline of assessments, and then essentially having a continuous review of where you could have risk and how you're getting feedback from your system to mitigate those risks.
I'll let you know when we get to about 12 minutes, okay?
Yeah, my goal is I can keep it to about 15 to
Okay.
18, and I can go relatively fast, and there's a 2-minute video. Yep. So a little bit about my background, just to give a little bit of an explanation. Before working for Summit, I spent about 4.5 years working with oil and gas, mostly involved on the integrity side of things. So I was a rehab project leader, which involves going out there with crews, digging up the pipeline to look at anomalies, deciding what the appropriate repair method would be, and repairing the pipeline and so forth. I also ran smart tools in the line that helps you analyze what's going on. Where do you have deformations? Where do you have potential corrosion? I was an integrity engineer who received that information and then made, how are we going to evaluate the entire system itself and create those rehab campaigns that I did as a rehab project leader. And then I also did a short stint as the damage prevention subject matter expert. So anytime there was an incident within the company, it would come across my desk so we can review, root cause analysis, whether from third party, internal, or, just something happening in general that we need to analyze. So again, this is where I could analyze our standards, making sure that we're in compliance with PHMSA as well as the company standards. So kind of starting off, you can kind of see here in the bottom left-hand corner, we'll kind of go into pipeline routing, but know that pipeline routing and design kind of go hand in hand. These are two paths that are constantly being ran in parallel with each other. So whenever you start looking at a pipeline routing, people think, okay, well, you have an ethanol plant, you have your sequestration area, you're obviously just going to pick the shortest path from A to B. And that's not the case. What happens is we're getting a lot of publicly available desktop information. It's called a desktop review. So we can start looking at what's applicable information as we start to route this pipeline. We're looking for some of those potential risks. We're looking for wetlands and water bodies. Where can we cross but not have unnecessary crossing of braided channels, larger rivers? We're looking for environmental situations for, fish spawning areas, endangered species, cultural areas. We're looking at the physiological features. Where do we have underground mines? Where do we have, steep slopes? How can we avoid these erodible soil areas or bedrock? As well as where do we have existing utility corridors, railroads, highways? All of these things are what we're considering when we do this initial desktop analysis. We can't just go A to B. We have to start routing around the risk as a pipeline. But you've got 2,000 miles of pipeline and 34 ethanol plants. So what happens is you mitigate your risk through routing, and then from there you kind of develop solutions around them. So you can say, if I'm going through a river, I'm going to start designing what I can do from that perspective, going deeper, looking at additional engineering solutions. So, like I said, that pipeline routing is an iterative process. We start off with that desktop review, and then we kind of go to in-the-field survey. So when you talk to landowners, the first thing that we do is not, can we execute an easement? It's, can we do walking surveys on your property? We need to know from a constructability issue, is it possible? If you've ever been on Google Earth or Google Maps and you look at it, you'll say, that looks kind of flat. And then you go there in person and it's a lot different than what you actually see there. So what we like to have this in-person survey, walking survey, so we can shoot in data points. We can say, okay, well, this actually isn't as constructible as we thought. We come back with that information, we'll make these micro adjustments along the route, and we'll kind of start changing it as we go. The first thing that we do from a desktop analysis is never the final thing. We get feedback from the landowner. Maybe there's a well we don't know about. Maybe there's some information where they don't want it on that side of their property. Can we move it here? So again, we like to move it when we can, but sometimes there's other physical limitations that are in place. So again, this is just a lot of information that's going into this routing, never as simple as, oh, here's where the route is, that's what it's going to be. Constant feedback. We have weekly meetings that, are responsible for these route revisions. So talking about pipeline design, I like to kind of show this bottom middle picture. Can you see my mouse? There we go. This bottom middle picture is what's called a pressure gradient or a hydraulic gradient model. So going along with the topography of the actual pipeline itself, we have to start looking at hydraulically, what's the pressure going to be in the pipeline system? The maximum operating pressure wasn't chosen arbitrarily. We know what the desired throughput of the pipeline is, and we know from topography limitations what it has to be. And this red line up here, that would be your maximum operating pressure. I think there's a little misunderstanding of what's going on with the pipeline. They say, oh, maximum operating pressure, you're probably running at that 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And that's just not the case. What you're really happening here is you see you have a localized high point. Over the entire system, they're looking at what is the maximum amount of pressure that this system could see. And we say that's our maximum operating pressure, and we need to test the entire system for that pressure just so we're being safe. You can see in many situations, it's never even going to come close to that maximum operating pressure, because while you're basically starting and seeing these spikes, whenever you are at an ethanol plant, let's say we're just going ethanol plant to sequestration area, you need to pressurize up at the ethanol plant, and as it's going across down to your discharge location, you have frictional loss, other situations where that pressure is dropping, and then when you get to an ethanol plant or a pump station, you'd pump back up. But again, the entire system needs to be rated for that maximum operating pressure, and we actually test it to be even above that. From a PHMSA requirement, the whole segment is hydraulically tested to 125% of that MOP. We hold it for 8 hours, and then for after that, it's never tested to that pressure again unless we would need to recalibrate it. So I only bring up that point to show, look, it's not, the whole system is not running at maximum operating pressure. It's actually much below, but you need to be safety conscious as you're working through the system and, doing the correct, tests going forward. We talk about PHMSA a lot, so I'm not necessarily going to go down that road. What I'd like to kind of touch on is some of these design standards that you see here. So when you talk about PHMSA, what people usually think about is, well, okay, yeah, of course there's construction design and operation standards. What people don't often know is that there's a whole different industry codes that pipelines are following to ensure that they are doing things consistent with what other pipeline companies are doing, and these are standard procedures across the board. This isn't something that Summit has came up with. These are industry standards that over the years people have created. They have experts that are on their boards that every year they're saying, what's our current standards? Let's review them, let's refine them, and then these experts tell the pipeline companies what we need to follow. And a lot of times PHMSA is going to dictate, or I should say, they're going to defer to these industry standards. I mean, if we're going through and continuously looking at ordinances, I would definitely encourage that everyone go through and maybe read a couple of these just to have an understanding of, it's not just the pipeline putting it where they want, how they want. There's a lot of different standards associated with it. For example, the API 5L here, that is the specification for line pipe. So they say, if you have a pipe, carbon steel that's going in the pipeline, here's the chemical composition that it has to be. It's saying you're going to have so much carbon in it, you're going to have so much sulfur in it. It's telling you how that pipeline actually has to be built in order for Summit to purchase it and put it in the pipe or in the ground itself. And then you have, here's 1104. So API 1104 says, here's your welding procedure now. Here's how you qualify welders. Here's the procedure they need to follow. And here's how you need to test those welds before it goes into service. Again, I won't go into this in too much detail. I'm trying to give more of a high-level overview because each of these probably could be their own 30-minute conversation. But just to show you guys, if you have any questions on these, we can always come back and explain further in the future. But just to show you that there is a lot more information that's kind of going on behind the scenes as it relates to both routing and pipeline design. We'll go to the next slide. All right. So, actually, I do want to touch on one more thing. Sorry about that. Bottom right-hand corner. A lot of times we're asked, this is a higher pressure pipeline than maybe a natural gas. Can you tell me that it's as safe as a natural gas pipeline, a crude pipeline? And that's why I like to show this. It's called Barlow's equation down here. So PHMSA says whenever you're designing a pipeline, here is what you must follow. So P is pressure, you got S is going to be the material, T is thickness, OD is the OD of your pipe, and the F is the factor of safety. From a pipeline perspective, we know our pressure because we know the throughput that we want. The OD, we know the material is carbon steel, and the factor of safety is given to us by PHMSA. So the really only unknown here is T. So we give all of our inputs, and what PHMSA gives us back from Barlow's equation is the thickness of our pipe. You can see with P being on this side, they're directly related. As the pressure goes up, the thickness is going to go up on the pipeline. So your factor of safety, if it's 500 PSI, if it's 1500 PSI, your thickness just continuously gets bigger as you go forward with it. And that design factor of safety right there, that's 0.72. So you're basically handcuffed in the situation where you're designing with a material that's not as strong as it really is. They're saying, okay, well, We know what the actual yield strength is. Let's assume it's much lower, and now you must design a pipeline with that understanding. And that tolerance is for pipeline safety. Again, it's got a 25 to 30-year corrosion tolerance built in with it too, just as an additional pipeline safety practice. And that 0.72 is going to be even more drastic under roadways where it's 0.6 and under navigable waterways where it's 0.5.
Sir, it's been about 12 minutes, so
Yep.
can you wrap up in the next 3?
I will go quickly through this with the integrity management plan. So the Summit's integrity management plan is all about creating your baseline assessment for hazards. What I will show is, where is it? What I will say is we have a third-party consultant that we've used to do our geohazards across the board. And this is to get that baseline assessment of where do we have potential issues so we can continuously work to manage and work around them. And the other thing that we're going to do, just because time's a little limited, I want to go over how else do we get continuous feedback from the system? And that's going to be by running these smart tools. The smart tools are how, what I like to say, it's kind of like a doctor checkup. You run them in the line, they tell you where you have potential problems, and you go out there and dig them. I'm going to show this short 2-minute video, and I'll kind of give the commentary. The sound's not as important. So this is for a crude line, so it's going to be a little bit different as it relates to the cleanliness of it. So a smart tool, what starts off with is you put a cleaning pig in the line. You're going to see, since it's a crude line, the inside's going to be a little bit dirtier, but you can see it's just kind of getting the grime that would be inside the pipeline. A CO2 pipeline is historically a lot cleaner than that, but you need a clean surface prior to actually running basically your computer in the pipeline itself. So what happens is, on a regular basis, we put these smart tools in the pipeline itself. So sometimes they're bigger than this, depending if you're adding additional technology. Depending on the line segment, you might have batteries. But the pig itself is going to go at about walking speed through the pipeline. And the whole goal is, we know what the pipeline wall thickness is, so it's measuring, are there defects? See, that might be a crack, maybe there's a deformation, and the smart tool is going to go through the entire line segment and gather this data and give it back to us. And from this, we can compare it to our baseline assessment. What was it last time we ran it? What was it originally? And we consistently get feedback from the system to know where there are problems, so we can go out there and fix them before they'd ever be a rupture, before they'd ever be a leak. And we get all this information, and you'll see, go to our computer, get this information. It's an iterative process, and the amount of information we're getting back from our system is quite substantial. And so let's say, okay, we found a issue that could be a problem. How do we evaluate it? And this is where you actually have a crew go out in the field. We'll have a technician actually manually assess it. So they'll say, okay, the tool called out 5% metal loss. Maybe I'm seeing 10% metal loss. They'll feed this information back into the algorithm so we can recalibrate the system, get more feedback to make sure that the rest of the pipeline is okay. We'll put what's called a B-sleeve on top of it. You weld up this section, and basically what you're going to do, is, it's not always little segments like that. I've usually seen 2 continuous 180 degrees. You double check the welding one more time, and then you wrap it up again. People have asked,
Quick question, before you run out of time. How often do you do this, or would you plan on doing it?
So it depends on the line segment, is what I always say, because there's a PHMSA requirement to do it every couple of years, but what you see is a pipeline operator for their integrity management plan says, maybe I know this segment of the pipeline is more prone to cracks. I'm going to run a cracking tool on it on a more regular basis to be more, proactive. This line might have more metal loss just because of the location it's in. I'm going to run a metal loss specific tool. So it really depends on your integrity management plan, because
But your bare minimum,
your bare minimum is going to be 5 years.
5 years, okay.
Yeah.
Okay, sir, I'm going to stop your presentation. I'm going to open it up for questions from the committee here, and I guess who would like to be first if you have any questions?
Got a couple questions for you. The Satartia, Mississippi incident, was that caused by a landslide?
So yes, it was. So the Satartia, Mississippi incident is already been reviewed by PHMSA. So the biggest shortcomings that they found out of the PHMSA requirement, we actually had a slide on it, but we won't go into it, was that, well, won't go into it in detail, was that they didn't properly evaluate the geohazards associated with the area. There was a massive drop-off that wasn't called out by the company, so they were deficient on their geohazard analysis. They didn't do a proper training to the fire department. I think Mr. Briggs was, aware of that he didn't have a CO2, I guess, he wasn't aware that there was a CO2 pipeline in the area, nor did they have the appropriate response equipment from a monitoring perspective to, be able to outline the area. And then they also had a lack in their dispersion modeling. So it's not a, question on why it happened. There's a deficiency from the company on about 3 big things that PHMSA calls out in their summary report. And it's also important to look at the location itself, because the amount of drop-off that you had at that location is just not something that you see normally in South Dakota. But our geohazard analysis has already done the footprint.
The hydrogen sulfide that was in the pipe down there, that's not just to make it smell like you put in your propane tank for your grill. That hydrogen sulfide, correct me if I'm wrong, it's like an additive used to help with the extraction process for oil and gas, right?
I don't know about the exactness of the extraction portion of it, but I do know it's a big part of oil and gas, just because it's from the actual, the concerning part of it. There's a reason there's an H2S monitor with every crew doing any work on pipelines, is because it is poisonous, it is explosive. But for the reason exactly why it was in the pipeline, that I can't attest to.
Would your proposed pipeline have hydrogen sulfide in it?
No, we believe that's more of a corrosive and dangerous material to add to it. So at this time, we have no plans to.
Do you know what the setbacks are down there in Satartia, Mississippi after the incident?
I do not know if they added additional setbacks or requirements following the incident. I would assume that they're just following the procedures put in place by PHMSA currently.
And then just one last question with regard to the thickness of the pipe. Some of the landowners, some farmers have come to me and said, well, I'm worried that I might drive my tractor or combine into the pipeline, and it's gonna, by driving your combine into this pipe, it's gonna cause a rupture. Can you speak to that issue?
Yeah, so what I'd say is there's a reason that the pipeline is 4 foot below the surface. So one is because it's lower than agriculture activity from a deep ripping scenario, but also when you look at your grain carts, your combines, fully loaded or not, the amount of weight dispersion that would be on top of that is not in a situation where it's going to impact the pipeline itself. So you can continue to drive. I think we've ran the scenario, even if there would be a train on top of it, that it's not a concern at that depth, just from the amount of weight that's being dispersed.
I think there's probably some people in agriculture that might disagree with you on that, but
I think it really depends, making sure that the best practices are followed during the compaction and the backfill of it. So I don't disagree. You need to be very careful. But at that depth, when properly backfilled using best management practices, the numbers would show that there's no concern.
any more questions for Mr. Nees? Is it Nees or Nyes? How you?
At Nice.
Nees, excuse me.
I've got a couple, Mr. Chair.
Okay, this, Mr. Nordsey.
Thank you, and thank you for coming today. My first question is you were talking about your background and what you do at Summit. You talked about any deficiency or defect or safety issue would come across your desk. Can you talk to me about what you've already seen?
So just to clarify, when I was in the damage prevention subject matter expert, that'd be incidences only. Now, the anomalies and everything else, now, when I was in the role, I saw a lot of them, but not every single one. But regardless, yeah, so a large portion of what I did was related to, like I said, a rehab project leader responds and looks at anomalies. You'll see corrosion, and a lot of that is going to be based upon, back in the day, they used coal tar coating. So very good coating when applied correctly, but when not applied correctly, sometimes water would seep underneath it, and then you'd have some external corrosion happening. So you'd see a lot of that external corrosion as a problem. Today we use FBE coating, which is a lot better, and it also doesn't shield cathodic protection. So you'll see the cathodic protection also would stop any potential corrosion. So your biggest incidents that I would say you see are third-party damage, and then going to be external corrosion. So usually how you prevent, third-party damage is going to be one calls, pipeline markers, things like that. But I could go into some incidents that I've seen, but I don't want to speak out of turn.
With what frequency do you see incidents? Is this a daily thing that you see these, or monthly?
Like incidents from third-party?
Any kind of incident that would put our citizens at risk?
So there weren't too many issues where you actually put them at risk from it is leaking perspective. I would say you have a lot of, we go out there and we will go check it quickly, because when you fly the pipeline every week or 2 weeks, you have situations where people are digging near the pipeline and you'll need to respond quickly just to make sure, did you put in a one call? We didn't respond to this. Now, there were scenarios where there was a train that actually derailed on top of our pipeline. It didn't rupture, but that's obviously a concern. So we went out there and checked it. One time, a tiling company didn't put in a one call, and they ran into the pipeline with the tiler. Didn't rupture as well, but all of those scenarios, we are going out there. I'd say those larger scenarios, the big ones maybe once a year, but obviously those can change. I wouldn't say that there is any big ruptures happening on a regular basis now.
Thank you. My next question goes to the construction itself. Is economics ever a consideration when you determine the path of a pipeline?
So you're saying, by using more pipe, being more expensive, dictate what we do as a company?
Different pipe depth, the actual route, do you actually take economic considerations into consideration?
So the pipeline thickness and maybe the depth is something that's more dictated by PHMSA. So when we are choosing our pipe itself, we know that it has to be in compliance, so our hands are essentially tied from that scenario. The only thing that we've maybe looked at is where you source your pipe, so you can get it cheaper abroad potentially. But I know we're planning and have committed to get here in the U.S. Different routing options are going to have pros and cons. The economics definitely come into some of those decisions, but I wouldn't say are a driving factor behind it.
Okay. I had one more question, but I forgot, so thank you.
Come back to it if you want.
Thank you. Any other questions?
You'll remember it in 10 minutes.
All right.
So I
Thank
do
you.
have one.
Oh, we have one yet. Okay.
So you said you guys go through and you go to landowners and want to do a walking survey.
That is correct. The first part of most of our easements is we're going to try to, if possible, ask them to do a walking survey. It doesn't lock you into an easement. It's more for a constructability assessment, I would say.
So when the landowners say no and you sue them, do you think that they're a little concerned about maybe zoning and routing?
I think each landowner has different opinions on maybe why they'll say no. Some of them do say, yeah, well, we'd like to get more information. Maybe they're not comfortable at that time. I know South Dakota has a process for going about it, and I think, like I said, if we need to follow that process, sometimes that's what we've done in the past.
How
But
many did you file in Lincoln County?
I do not have that number. I do know that we've pulled all those at this time, though.
And second of all, I thought we were talking about pipeline today. I didn't see a route for Lincoln County for the new route. Do you have that publicly available?
Well, I think today's
And
intentions.
then also,
Sorry.
I would also like to see your plume study publicly.
So I think the first part of looking at the pipeline is understanding how a route is chosen, what goes into the design, because I kind of think of it as a stair step. If you want to start looking at, siting a pipeline, I think it's understanding that what goes into it from an industry perspective, how are we designing it, and where's the route being picked. So yeah, we have information. We're kind of under a time crunch. I have 7 more slides I would have also liked to go over, but I think getting kind of the base footing of any pipeline project is important as we continuously get to that information.
So those maps that you pick and you draw a line on, do you consent the landowners before you draw a line and then start sending those maps around?
So the first thing we're doing is looking at where do we have potential risks. Because if I route a pipeline from A to B, and then I do my geohazard analysis, and I find that there's underground mines in that area, well, then I'm going to route out that landowner regardless. I'm looking for, the most strategic location first to start looking at how I mitigate risks. And then as I talk to landowners, we can start those discussions. So
Right, but wouldn't it be better to notify the landowner first of intent?
before looking at all the risks of the pipeline?
No, when you're designing a pipeline and you figure out where you want to route, and then you have questions or concerns you're not aware of, wouldn't it be better to notify the landowner in writing before you even attempt this next process? Because once you draw a line through somebody's land you don't own, that's not yours until you have an agreement. And so when that is shared publicly, that becomes almost a terrorism threat for the landowner and security breach. And so we need to make sure that that's being done correctly.
And I would say we're kind of looking at different options as we are, like you're saying, it's an iterative process. We talk to landowners all the time, make those micro adjustments, and kind of gauging what the response is. I'd say,
So I'll just take the answer as no.
as that we don't reach out to landowners, I would say we
No.
do talk to landowners.
No, when I said, when you draw a line and you pick a route,
Okay.
are you notifying those landowner before those maps get sent out and handed to people so they can see publicly where that line is routed?
I would say the exact route is never shared publicly from the beginning. I know from a, Homeland Security perspective, there's a situation there. When we submit our maps to the P&Z, that's why there's a confidentiality behind it. And I think that's usually what PHMSA has said in the
Right,
past as
but
well.
now you've put landowners in a national security risk, which are the agricultural base of this country. We feed the world. And so even on a property I know about, they drew a line where a road didn't exist. People broke through the gates, went hunting on it, did other things illegally without any consent because they showed a road going through it. And so once again, the intent that is done by the company may be in just an honest mistake, but there should be a further process in this. And I think that has to be addressed.
All right,
Thank
thank you. None other questions? I think we'll go ahead, just looking at the public here, I think it's important we take a 5-minute break. Let's stand or whatever, it's 11:11, and we'll reconvene at 11:16. And before we start on item number 5, I'm going to pass the chair position over to my assistant chair, Mr. Scott, for the remainder of the meeting. Okay, reconvene at, what did they say, 11:16 or so?
5 minutes.
Yes, thank you.
Can I get a motion to reconvene? Got a motion and a second, all in favor, aye?
Aye.
All opposed? All right, we're back together and we're on to agenda item number 5. And I guess the way I understand it is, after some of the testimony we've had today, is there anything more that any of the board members would like to see for testimony, maybe next week?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman,
Yeah.
I'll be inviting the former director of PHMSA to testify to us, and I believe that he has agreed to do so. I don't recall if that's going to be December 12th or December 19th, though. I'll have to go back and check, but he's agreed to come here and testify.
Okay. Yeah.
Last week, we talked about the possibility of somebody from the PUC providing some information. Were they contacted? Anybody know? I know Steve isn't here today, but. Okay.
We aren't sure yet. Maybe we can talk about that next week. Will Steve be here next week? Okay, very good. One other idea I guess I did have, and I reached out, waiting to hear back, is maybe having a representative from South Dakota Corn come and just explain their stance on this project and how it could or couldn't affect corn production in the state of South Dakota. I'll have more information next week.
Yeah, and Mr. Chair, I called South Dakota Corn a couple weeks ago. I think it's 3 or 4 weeks ago. At that point in time, they had not taken a position
Right.
on the issue. I don't know if they've since changed. I know that South Dakota Farm Bureau, I'm a Farm Bureau member. I know that at their convention, they took a position on this. I actually have a handout. I can hand that out to anybody who wants to see it. Scott Vanderwall's quoted in there. I guess I'd also like to, or intend on inviting, there's an institute in Sioux Falls that did an economic issue on what it would do for the corn basis, what it would do for the economics of ethanol plants. And then also, I think it'd be helpful to invite these people from GEVO. GEVO is the Sustainable Aviation Fuel Company that they need a CO2 pipeline. They're the ones who want to build the billion-dollar plant up there by Lake Preston. I think it'd be helpful to hear from them as well as what the economic effects would be on farmers of being able to turn corn into aviation fuel.
Is that meeting where there
So,
were?
hold on just a second, Mr. Ventura, let's finish up with Mr. Aaron's comments. So Commissioner Aaron's, it's my understanding that South Dakota Corn's meeting tomorrow and going to get in more in depth into this, and I don't know what the outcome will be, but we'll maybe have more information after that. And so by next week's meeting, I think we'll have probably a little more definite answer if they'd be willing to come talk or not. And then as far as GEVO, maybe that's somebody you could reach out to and see what their interest would be, and we could discuss that as well next week.
Sounds good.
If they'd be
When it
willing.
comes to GEVO, I do have a question. Did
Yeah,
we have
go ahead.
any commissioners or board members there last week?
GEVO wasn't there last week.
So, yeah, currently, we're gonna stay on task, Mr. Ventura, and we're on agenda item number 5. We're just talking about further testimony. If you want to bring that up later on, I think you sure can. But currently, let's keep it to that.
Sure.
Anyone else? Okay, very good. I think we'll move with that. I don't know that we're gonna, unless somebody has a hard motion they'd like to make of somebody that needs to be here next week and that they have a definite yes from, I think we'll just move on to agenda item number 6. And that has Commissioner Aaron's name attached to it, so I'm assuming that's something that he would like to discuss, so I'm gonna hand it over to him and let him lead the discussion. I have talked to legal, and they are somewhat prepared to answer questions. So if we have questions, Drew did say he would do his best to answer them.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. So I spoke with Drew earlier today during our commission meeting as well as last night. Had some correspondence with him via email. So I think what would be important from the committee's point of view is to understand what the authority is of a county commission legally with regard to pipeline regulation. And so if you can't answer any of this in open session, just say so, and maybe that'll serve as the impetus to use the executive session to be able to answer these. But these are quite a few questions that I've gotten and have for myself. But I think a couple questions here we'd like to know are, number one, are setbacks preempted by federal law?
I'll give a typical, excuse me, maybe a typical attorney answer. I think that depends. So you have the letter from PHMSA that says that local authorities have the ability to regulate setbacks. Consequently, I guess just yesterday, a federal district court judge in Iowa had ruled that, and I'm paraphrasing, that letter is basically irrelevant and preempted Story County setbacks that were a quarter mile and enjoined the Story County setbacks just yesterday from being established and being enforced based upon the fact that it would be preempted by the Secretary of Transportation and PHMSA. And so that's why I say that depends, I guess, because I don't really have a concrete answer at this point because I need to fully dissect that opinion yet and do some more research.
Drew, can you check your microphone for a minute? I don't know.
Is
if
it
it's
not
on.
working?
It's not working, no. Not
Is it
everybody's
working now? No?
No.
Okay.
Maybe you can switch with Toby if his works.
How about now? No? Okay.
Up there. If you wouldn't mind, yeah, maybe, just so everybody can hear a little better.
Sorry about that.
There, now we can hear you.
Okay. Just to kind of reiterate what I said before, to Commissioner Aaron's question is the county commissions or the county's authority to regulate setbacks. you had the PHMSA letter that says that the local political subdivisions have the ability to regulate setbacks. Just yesterday, a federal district court judge in Iowa preempted a Story County setback requirement of a 1/4 mile, stating that it was preempted by PHMSA and the Secretary of Transportation Authority. I want to have the ability to research that opinion. It's a lengthy opinion. I will qualify that in saying that Iowa, as Mr. Brown had stated, Iowa laws and South Dakota laws are different, though. So with that, I will go kind of speaking to the agenda item. Under the PUC laws, they do give deference to local subdivisions, and they've shown that in their opinion by denying preemption in that the pipeline companies had to show or have the burden of proof to show that they're working with political subdivisions, local political subdivisions, or that they have to show a burden of proof that local political subdivision ordinances are fully restrictive. So, again, paraphrasing some of those opinions, but that maybe answers some of your questions.
Yeah, and Drew, just so you could explain for folks, federal law still applies, though, at all times, correct?
Correct. Federal law would still apply, but the process is different from Iowa
Right.
and South Dakota. So that's where the distinction would be.
Yeah, so just to give a word of caution to people who may say, well, Iowa law is different than South Dakota law, that may affect one level of preemption, but there's also the federal preemption argument that takes superseding authority over all state law regardless of your process, correct?
To an extent, yes, I guess that's correctly stated, but the permitting process in the states are different. I mean, for example, in Iowa, basically local political subdivisions have no say other than there's a requirement, there's a public hearing, and it doesn't even need to be recorded. Whereas in South Dakota, the burden is stated within the application process that they are asserting that they're following all rules and laws. So there is a distinction between the two, yes.
Okay. Now, with regard to what the PUC said with regard to preemption, I just want to clarify this because I think some have taken this and run with it. The PUC didn't issue an order stating that counties have authority to regulate pipelines, sans federal law. I've got the order here from the PUC. What the PUC said is we're not going to step in on Moody County and Minnehaha County, given a whole host of other state law factors that they believe that Navigator Greenway did not follow. Could you kind of talk us through whether, did the PUC actually issue an order authorizing counties to quote-unquote regulate pipelines? Or did they, could you explain actually what happened at the preemption hearing?
I'll try my best, I guess, but yes and no. I think they are deferring to local political subdivisions to an extent, and I think that goes back to basic South Dakota ordinance law that any ordinance passed is presumption of validity. So I think that's one aspect that they reviewed, and then the second aspect was that the pipeline companies didn't present any testimony to establish their burden of proof that the ordinances were so restrictive that it was basically barring any type of construction project. And also, there was no, and I have to think back, I'm going off of memory of reading the order.
And I got a copy of it here if you want to see it, but yeah.
Yeah, I think that's the extent of it, and that there was no burden that they've actually proven that they've shown the ability to work with local political subdivisions or local landowners too, and I think that was the other portion of it.
Because I just want to clarify for the record here, the PUC did not give Lincoln County or any other county permission to deviate from federal law, did it? PUC is not allowed to wave its magic wand and say, Lincoln County, you don't have to follow federal law, did it?
Not specifically, no, but I think it goes back to the presumption of validity with the ordinance that's passed by a local
But at the
political
same time,
subdivision.
federal law doesn't state a lot of these setbacks that we're talking about, correct?
Yes and no
i.e. for
too.
residents.
They set minimum standards, basically,
Yeah.
is what they would do. Yeah.
Okay.
So I know, we've talked about Heartland Greenway, but the PUC also made a ruling or denied the Summit application. Can you talk about that reasoning?
I think it's the exact same reasoning. That's why I didn't specify which company. I just spoke in generalities, that it's basically the same ruling for all companies essentially. They just didn't meet their burden.
So you're saying that these two counties passed ordinance, these companies didn't try to go obtain waivers, they didn't actually see if they could find a way around this or try to work the system, they just tried to run through the PUC and say, oh, you guys go override these counties because they're being mean to us. Is that basically the presumption of this thing in a shortened redneck style conversation?
I can't speak to that. I can only speak to what the order said, that they didn't meet their burden and show any proof of that, I guess.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Anyone else? Any questions for Drew?
With regard to the setback issue, so just to lay some foundation for that, is the CO2 pipeline subject to the Pipeline Safety Act?
PHMSA regulations?
Yes.
Yes, they would have to meet the minimum standards, yes.
And in the PHMSA regulation, it provides a 50-foot setback for pipelines, correct?
I believe that's correct, yes.
Now, when Congress occupies the field and says, hey, you pipeline, you got to follow this rule, are other jurisdictions allowed to pile on top of that and add on to that?
I'm not going to comment at this time. I'm just not going to comment on that.
Okay. Would you agree with me that's probably the primary issue here legally?
I'll reserve comment for that.
Okay, all right, thank you.
Yeah.
Maybe a little different angle on that. Isn't that, yeah, it's on. It would be, in fact, true that the PUC's decision that they made, whatever angle or view you want to take of that, all of that occurred prior to the federal court ruling that you're saying just happened yesterday.
Correct.
Thank you.
Is that ruling up for review? Can it be appealed?
Yeah, and that's a great point. Story County still has the ability to appeal that, and that would go up to the 8th Circuit Court of Appeals. So I thought it was worth noting because that would be our circuit, and so it's an important case, and quite frankly, I hope Story County does appeal. Just to get an answer, it'd be nice from our standpoint, legal standpoint, to have a definitive answer.
You guys are kind of running blind here a little bit, aren't you, in this whole process?
To some extent, yes.
Yeah. Okay, any other questions? I think we'll move on. All right. Thank you, Mr. DeGroot. Thank you, Mr. Aaron's. Okay, we'll move on to agenda item number 7. And discussion and input from committee members, and we'll just bullet point these out. I think we'll start with letter A, which I thought we had a pretty good discussion at the beginning of the meeting when Mr. Brown was up here, and I guess I'm just gonna ask, does everybody understand why having the proper definitions is important in this ordinance process? And if not, do you have anything to add or questions? Okay. I'll just say, I think that was one of the high points that Mr. Brown pointed out, and I think that if we're gonna do this correctly, that we make sure that those definitions are right, and I will say that I go along with Mr. Anderson's statement that, and in my notes, it says that it'd be the easiest to use the state and federal definitions since they're already there, so. Okay. Letter B, appropriate setback requirements for land use purposes. I don't know how we really want to attack that. We do have the i.e. spreadsheet that Toby put up at the beginning that showed all the past ordinances and what the setbacks were for each one of those. Is there anything in particular in those that you guys would like to discuss? And maybe on why there's a difference or why they are what they are, or if you have opinions on why they should be something different.
Let's put it up, I got nothing to say.
What's that?
I'll put it up, I have nothing to say.
Okay. You just stay up there, though, in case we have a question.
I'll come back.
You know, I guess there's lots of different issues on this topic, but this seems to be the issue.
Correct.
And so, you know, my suggestion would be that we spend what time we have left in the next couple of meetings significantly addressing or talking about setbacks. And I say that with the acknowledgement that, at least for myself, I have significantly limited knowledge. And so the importance of listening to various experts is important. Now, we know they're gonna be on both ends of that spectrum, and we get to decide which one we want, but I think we should spend a good chunk of our time on that topic.
Thank you, Mr. Anderson. Anything else?
I think maybe we just see what Toby and legal can put up, start writing an ordinance, and then we can start discussing these numbers maybe next week. Start moving forward. That's why we're here. But this has been 3 years in the process. It's not like it's something just happened yesterday. So it's 3 years we're gonna be on this process.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think the one thing I've gleaned out of the last 3 meetings is at the end of the day, I think what people want to do is just what Mr. Anderson had suggested is, let's just start with this thing one by one and start having conversations with it, because I mean, that's what we're ultimately doing is we're here for a setback ordinance. So I think that might be, that might be a good exercise for next week's meeting. Unless everybody wants to stay here for a lot longer today, we can sure talk about it, continue to visit, huh? No. I think it'd be good to wait till next week, now that we have the information, even though I would encourage everybody to come to the monthly planning commission meetings. They're exhilarating and they're a lot of fun. I understand that a lot of you probably weren't at these when we were talking about them, so this is good to get you up to speed. So we'll move on to letter C, appropriate zoning districts and uses. That was something Toby also brought up earlier. And I think that going forward, does everybody understand that in the rural residential and the commercial industrial districts that if I understood that right, Toby, currently the setback ordinances that we have talked about wouldn't have mattered. Yeah, it is. Would you give us that bullet point again quick about the previous ordinances and how or if they would have affected rural residential, commercial, industrial?
Yeah, so just zoning 101 is that when you establish a comprehensive plan, you establish zoning districts to correspond with the comprehensive plan. And in Lincoln County, we've established, as you see on the screen, A1, which is our predominant district. It's not just agricultural, there's other uses within it. The rural residential district, which is a rezone to allow greater density than the 1 per quarter for residential. R1 is an even greater density, down to 7,500 square feet for residential constructions, and commercial would be general commercial type, retail type uses. I1 would be light industrial uses. I'll say obnoxious type uses that occur within a building. I2 is our high, it'd say I2 would be your more high intensive use district, but it's not. Actually, A1 is your more high intensive district and even your I2 district, but generally industrial type, manufacturing type uses. Within all of those zoning districts, we've broken it down to uses within the zoning districts. Permissive uses, which under state law are by right, meaning that if I own property in the county, I can do a permissive use with essentially with minimal type standards, but primarily then utilize my property for those uses. Permitted special use, very confusing. It's a hybrid of a permissive use and a conditional use. Permitted special use is permitted uses that we put standards or conditions on. As long as the landowner can meet those conditions, they can come into our department and we can issue a building permit without public hearing. as long as they meet those standards within it. A lot of discretion up to the department, though. Conditional uses strictly have to be approved by the Planning Commission, appealable to the Board of Commissioners with conditions attached to them. So 99% of the conditional use permits or conditional uses in all of the zoning districts in Lincoln County do not have specific standards to them. They're non-standard uses. But the conditional use is brought before the Planning Commission, public hearing, public input, and at that time, the Planning Commission puts applicable standards or regulations, conditions on those different types of uses. So they're not essentially standard uses. And again, as drafted, it would be within the A1, the RC. Commissioner Aaron's drafted it within the I1 district. And permissive use in Commissioner Aaron's with the ability for conditional use if you didn't meet those standards. The other two ordinances, Mr. Ventura ordinance, are permitted specials, which again means meet the standards. If you don't, the pipeline can apply to override the standards with a conditional use permit. And Carl Lem's ordinances has no zoning districts and no uses within it. Okay?
Can I make a comment?
Yeah. Anybody have any questions for Toby? It sounds like you do first.
Toby, I wanted to clarify, at one of the hearings, one of the Summit representatives stood up and said, if you don't let us in all the districts, you're holding us back, you're being too restrictive. And I believe what the Planning and Zoning Department decided, or the board decided, was to let them into all districts, so they're trying to appease them also. And so I think that's a smart plan. If we're gonna do anything, it should fit into everybody, not just one area.
Yeah, and that was kind of, if you recall at that public hearing, we were just kind of, running on the fly. Let's just put that, let's be honest. I think if you go back to the staff reports the staff put back together back in December, January, February, you've seen us evolve as well. I mean, that we've understood the topic more. We've gone through this process where, over the last 3 years, staff's been involved statewide with it. But locally, we've been heavily involved over the last year in Lincoln County with it. I think it's problematic, though, it's just staff's opinion. It'd be problematic to say you got a setback from a business, but then allow it in a business district.
Yeah.
And then I think we miss the point of this is a land use issue. If it's a land use issue, you want to specifically say, this is where we want it, this is where we don't want it. And that's one of the things we struggle with in Lincoln County is that, zoning is meant to be here, not here, right? You don't want to be exclusionary, you don't want to be overly restrictive with what your regulations and things like that. The challenge in Lincoln County, though, is our A1 zoning district is a potpourri of land uses. And so, is it appropriate in A1? That's not staff's determination, that's this board's and the Board of Commissioners' determination. But it's something that should be looked at,
So just for clarification, we can't in this ordinance, though, can we restrict the pipelines from going into certain zoning districts? We can just adjust the setback per district and the requirements?
No, I think every zoning district is unique in its own, or there's uses that aren't allowed. So you don't have to, no. You could restrict it to what land uses you want it in.
Interesting.
But now, if you say we don't want it in the A1, you might have an issue with it, that's your predominant zoning district.
Yeah. And just to clarify that, so I would say the ordinance so far that's made it the farthest is what do we call it, the June 20th or 21st? That one did not have that in it, correct? And the Minnehaha County one, does the Minnehaha County one restrict it in certain zonings?
Yeah, the applicant's submittal was A1 RC. The recommendation Planning Commission was all the zoning districts.
Okay,
But again, in hindsight,
as we've thought about it now.
yeah, because again, in a county, in a city, you have true zoning districts, right? In Sioux Falls, we have industrial parks, we have residential developments, you have commercial, some nodal type development. In the county, it's spotty, right? We have the best spotty example would be the auto auction. You got light industrial right in the middle of ag land. And that's not uncommon. You got other areas in the county where there's multiple types of uses. If you don't have it within those zoning districts, can't be in those zoning districts. It'd have to be moved around.
Sure.
You know, and I would say that the other issue that we should probably talk about next week is, as we move on from today's, is how does pipelines work now in the ordinance? Not just carbon pipelines, but oil pipelines, and how did DAPL get approved, and what zoning districts are they in, and things like that.
I think that'd be a good.
That's something we can
discussion.
discuss, you know, what's our current
Yeah.
standards and regulations and things like that, so, yeah.
Okay, good.
Hey, Toby, I had one more question. If something like this was built and you used the plume study, would you come up with like an economic dead zone in a certain area around these places? And that would be factored into development in general?
Well, I don't think I would. I think the Board of Commissioners would, and the Planning Commission would. Really what we're talking about is a policy, you know, and what is that number gonna be? And I think if it was that easy, I think I jokingly said at the start of this whole process in February, is I said, look, I worked for a year on 2 sentences, wind towers, right? Well, 2 sentences, we worked a whole year on it. This, we started with a 20-page ordinance, we're down to a 6-page ordinance, you know, we're still getting there, but the most critical part of this is how does this impact the setback part of it? And I've long said as staff is, I don't care what that number is, but I gotta know why it's that number. Because I'm the one that has to deal with the phone calls of people coming in every day. And it's almost like dealing with toddlers at time, because they always say, why? Why is this setback this way? You know, we say, because it is what it is, you know? And they'll still say, why is it this way? You know, and if you go back to the testimony at the PUC, is more than likely I'd be the one testifying, and I need to know why is this setback. So it's not opposed to setback, not opposed to what it is. I just need to know what's it based on. And I think everyone, the public wants to know that as well
Right.
too, so.
I think so
Yeah.
too.
Yep.
Toby, with regard to natural gas pipelines, those are 50 feet. Have you had any issues with natural gas pipeline safety issues in the county here since you've been on planning and zoning?
No, I would say we've replaced most of the main lines in the county though, since I've been here, yeah.
All right. There's been no emergency response to any of those, though?
Not that I'm aware of, but I'd have to defer to Harold on that. We wouldn't be notified, probably.
Yeah, you know, in my office, I work 12 hours a day, 50 feet away from a natural gas pipeline. It goes through the backyard, city of Sioux Falls. Has there been any problematic issues with regard to people wanting to build houses or developments or anything right up to that 50-foot buffer?
I'll defer on the 50-foot. I don't believe that's, you know, they can go depth deeper and then they don't have to meet the 50-foot setback, but, so I won't go into detail on that. But what I would show, and I just put this together because I think it's important. I gotta get to this here. I can pull it up. So we reference this almost on a weekly basis on our office. This is a public domain. There is an offset to it though because of national security reasons and things like that, but this shows all of the pipelines that are in Lincoln County, and I'll get to that point now. This shows all of the incidents and all of the accidents with pipelines. And these are all of the existing pipelines that are run through Lincoln County. So again, we do reference this. This is offset by, you know, don't quote me, but I think it's 150 feet just for national security reasons. And if you zoom in enough, you can't see exactly where they are within the properties, but these are all the pipelines in the county right now. And in zoning, and I'll get more into this next week if you guys wish, but we don't issue, again, a building permit, a zoning permit for pipelines that are underground. Anything that's above ground that's 120 feet in structure, square feet in structure, we do issue a conditional use permit for. And, you know, Commissioner Scott knows that we did, over the last 2 years, we've done a significant number of those for the natural gas because most of the natural gas main lines have been replaced within the last 2 years within Lincoln County, main lines, so.
Toby, would you be willing to hand out to the members of this committee that heat map that you produce for me that compares the different ordinance proposals and it kind of shows where or where not the pipeline could be built based upon which ordinance would be selected.
Yeah, so that's on the commission website under the agenda meeting that was considered. Staff did put together a map that showed the 750 setback, but what I'd caution on that is a disclaimer on that is that it doesn't take into account the waiver concept. It also doesn't take into account the actual route pipeline. Our office has never been given an official route. You know, we've referenced the PUC site, but that's not the actual site, you know, or it's not the, what I would call our firsthand data set, so. But yeah, we'll put that link onto the committee's webpage, so.
Now,
Thank you.
I heard him talk about natural gas pipelines and people living 50 feet from them. How many people in Lincoln County live next to a carbon pipeline as of today?
There's been none permitted in Lincoln County that I'm aware of.
Right, so we
Yeah.
don't know, and that's the thing, is I think we're trying to pass this off like it's something else. It's different.
But, yeah.
Okay,
Okay.
thanks for sharing.
Thanks, Toby. Okay, so, that started as agenda item number 7C and kind of bled into 7D and, additional criteria, and thanks for commenting on that, Toby. I guess unless there's anything else that anybody thinks is super important, I think we'll move on. Is there anything else?
Mr. Chair?
Yes.
I'd like to add something under additional criteria, just
Yep.
because these are the thoughts that are going through my head as I think through this, is to the extent legally permissible, which we'd have to verify, but I definitely want to see some financial criteria, some inspection criteria, some indemnification, and some surety bonding, all as part of a potential ordinance, if it's legally permissible. But I think that gives us some controls that we currently don't have.
Yeah. Did you catch that, Drew? If you could do a little research on those? Thank you. Okay, agenda item number 8, committee discussion of any and all non-agenda CO2 pipeline regulations as authorized by the resolution of the Lincoln County Commissioners. I think this is it's an open-ended agenda item for us to discuss things that I guess are not on the agenda. So, does anybody have any?
I guess I have one. There's a township in Lincoln County that passed a CO2 ordinance. I think it's the standard that maybe we need to start looking at on this board. And so I think it's a good footprint to start the model. Thank you.
Drew, I have a question for you. Do townships in South Dakota have the authority to regulate a CO2 pipeline?
I'll admit, most of my focus is on the county. I haven't looked at it from a township perspective, but I think it would fall loosely within the provisions of the PUC, that local laws or rules. But I'd have to look more in depth into that.
So I can speak on that a little bit as a township supervisor myself. And I forget the law, it's
8-2-1.
that one. And it basically gives the authority to the township to, for the safety of their citizens and the protection of their land, to do whatever they deem necessary. But it's also my understanding then, they can do that, but if the county would preempt it if they pass an ordinance, and same with the state and so on
Right.
and so forth. So, but as long as there isn't something on the books at the county
Right.
level, the township can do what they want.
Yeah,
That's
and
my
I guess that's what I was thinking of, the PUC when, and I think it's subdivision 1 of the application process, that all laws and rules, I think that would probably fall underneath
Yeah.
that.
Now,
And that's how we operate in our township, is that if there isn't something on the books at the county level and we deem it necessary within our township, then we've been advised by our legal counsel that we can do that.
here's another comment. If Lincoln County has something on the books, but they're not addressing a certain part of another part of this, like noise, something like that, the townships do have the authority to make those rules also.
So you're, I guess, just to clarify your question, you're talking about the more restrictive regulation rule, I guess, is what you're speaking to.
Correct.
Again, my focus is predominantly on the county. I'd
Right.
have to look into that, but I can reserve comment and I'll
Yeah.
get back to you. Yeah.
Could we look into this issue of whether, because it's coming up in these townships, they're not getting what they want out of the Fed, they're not getting what they want out of the state, not getting what they want out of the county, so they're like, well, we'll just pass a township rule. I think the issue is whether or not townships have the authority to pass such a rule. And as part of the recommendation process as a commissioner, what I'd like to hear is, do they possess the legal authority to regulate pipeline siting, number one? But the second thing I'd like to know is, Commissioner Scott just now referenced safety. I mean, I think it's pretty clear cut. Only the federal government is authorized to regulate the safety of pipelines, correct?
Yeah, that's a good point to bring up. And
It also states landowner rights, so I mean, you can dump it into either bucket. It gives it a pretty broad, if you want to go read the statute, I'm sure you have it, but it gives the township pretty broad brush. And I guess my only comment to that, and I'm just going to keep moving on, Commissioner Aaron's, is Mr. DeGroot isn't legal counsel for every township in the county. Most townships have their own legal counsel. They also aren't regulated by the county commission, and so I guess we'll leave that discussion as is. The townships will do what they want based on their legal counsel, and I don't think that you need to come up with if the townships have that authority or not.
I have a comment. So we have township, which is a local government, which is your localest, closest part of government for the citizens. The next step is the county commission. Then you have your state government and your federal government. And I encourage the county commissioners to stay in their lane, just like the state and the federal government need to stay in theirs.
I would add municipalities are in there too. As well.
Well, Commissioner Scott, I want
Yeah,
to
no.
ask you a question.
Well, I want to
So-
I want to comment on this just quickly. For the betterment of moving on the meeting and not getting us off track. This is a committee that was appointed by the county commission to recommend an ordinance. I guess the process is going to go to the county commission, back to the planning commission, and so on and so forth. I don't believe that this committee should spend a lot of time, both per Mr. Ventura's request or what you've been asking, on what the townships feel is right for them. And if Fairview Township thinks that their setback needs to be how many feet, that's their business. I don't think we need to take that necessarily into consideration at the county level. I think we're looking at this from a county standpoint. And if we want to get down the rabbit hole of townships, this thing will turn into a lot more. And I think that the townships are fully prepared, at least the ones that I talk to, that if we can't do this at a county level and get it figured out, the townships are going to do their own thing. And not only with carbon pipeline setbacks, I just think more issues in the future. They're aware of what their abilities are and are going to start taking more action. So, any additional criteria, or we're still on number 8. Is there any more discussion on that?
Yeah, here's my position.
Yep.
This committee is going to make a recommendation to the county commission. I'm one of those county commissioners out of the 4. As part of what I'd like to hear, in order to help inform and educate me, is I would like to hear what the authority of the townships is.
Yep. And, yeah, that's fine. I would ask, why or how would that make any difference on how we make I guess I'll ask that. How or why would that make any difference how we draft an ordinance within our county?
Well, maybe we don't need to have an ordinance if townships have the authority to do it themselves.
Good point. Okay.
Maybe this issue is completely a township issue, right?
I think.
It's my understanding that it currently can be that.
And I think that's the dispute here, and I think as a commissioner who you're making a recommendation to, Me personally,
I see.
I would like to have an answer to that.
Yeah,
I think 3 years into this process, if you didn't know townships can pass laws is a concern. But the point is if a township has passed something, I think we just look at those numbers as always recommending and move forward. But I agree with Commissioner Scott. Thank you.
yeah. Okay. Well, anything else? Agenda item number 8. Broad carbon pipeline topic discussion. Anything? Okay. Here again, I think agenda item number 9, to be honest, is somewhat redundant, but if anybody has any last quick things that haven't been discussed, we can add them now. Nothing? Okay, now we're going to open the floor to public comment. And just so you're aware, you can comment on anything. It didn't have to be on the agenda, whatever you want to comment on. So just please keep your comments to 5 minutes and keep them to new and pertinent information, if you would. Thank you.
Scott, are we doing 5 or 3? At the very beginning, we had established a 3 minute.
Okay, I guess we're going to go 3.
Okay, 3 minutes. My name is Kelly Brack and Stratton Circle in Sioux Falls. I just wanted to remind the committee that all the testimony that we heard this morning from Tony, going over the testimony of the experts, also from the Summit Carbon Solutions themselves, this testimony has already been presented, and their permit was denied, and that was on September 11, 2023. So this is not anything new that's being presented, and I just wanted to point that out to the committee. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good morning, Scott Montgomery, Fairview, South Dakota. I got a whole list here. I could go for 15, 20 minutes, but can I ask questions of you people,
No,
of the committee?
no, this is.
Okay, then I'll state a fact. Summit has never built, owned, or operated 1 inch of pipeline. So why are we listening to them as experts? They're not in the pipeline business until they tried to do this, and they've been turned down because they haven't followed the rules. South Dakota turned them down because they didn't follow the ordinances that the county passed. Simple. We were led to believe that CO2 historically is cleaner than oil-based. We've only got 5,000 miles of CO2 pipeline in this country. That's the most in the world, by the way. So I don't know how we can say historically. I mean, there's not much history on it. And I noticed also he said that we run this equipment through there every couple of years, and then when pressed, it became from a couple to 5. The pipeline people are not being honest with us. They're not being open. My feeling is don't trust them. Okay, at the PUC, the Navigator showed their plume study. What was it? 1,855 feet on each side of the pipeline. That was for a 6-inch pipeline, correct? Okay, why would we even consider anything less than 1,855 feet on a 6-inch pipeline? We're talking 24-inch pipeline. I think we're just running around in circles here like chickens with their head chopped off. We've already been presented the evidence by the pipeline people, 1,855 feet. Why would this committee consider anything less than that? Remember, these are the experts. 1,855 feet. Why are we here wasting our time, spinning our wheels? I sat here all morning for what? The evidence has already been presented, and we act like we're going to put our fingers in our ears and not listen to it. It's very apparent one of the members of this board is very pro-pipeline, and so be it. How about the rest of us be anti-pipeline? Let them prove the safety of this thing. We keep saying natural gas pipeline. Natural gas pipeline and CO2 pipelines are entirely different. They're nothing of the same. We can't compare them. I suggest you guys go and read about what CO2 pipeline consists of and the material it carries and how it's carried versus natural gas. They're two entirely different beasts. And I would hope you guys would educate yourself on this. That's your job here. This whole thing is built on carbon credits, green energy. Okay, if we're going to have green energy, why would we worry about these ethanol plants? They're going to be eliminated if we go through this green energy. My last comment is I'd like to know how many members were at Lake Preston for that meeting and violated the open meetings policy. We better look at that real hard. We were told that that doesn't exist. We gotta obey the law. That law was violated at Lake Preston.
Thank you, Mr. Montgomery. Anyone else?
Dwayne Skipper, Sioux Falls. I'm just a member of the general public listening to this for the last year, year and a half, whatever. The first thing I saw was a map by a local TV station showing a proposed route up into North Dakota where they were going to dump this CO2 into the ground a mile deep. Then I hear there's $300 million in loans already approved to get this thing going. Then I hear there's a billionaire or something up in North Dakota that happens to own the land where the pipe is going to be dumped. Then I hear people in North Dakota talk about, well, gee, now we're going up towards Bismarck. And then the little question comes up, well, God, we can use this for oil. What I'm saying is that we're talking about all these legal things. I'm listening to it as a general public person, no land involved, and saying, what is the reason for doing this in the first place? I would like to see, it could be a one-page definition. Why are we capturing CO2? What are the facts behind doing it? How much difference is it going to make? Where's the money and leave the money in the word economic development out of it. It has to have a defined reason for even existing or wanting to do it. And I have not heard that in any of this. And I've got plenty of facts of my own, like 75,000 square miles of burning wildfires, which is millions and millions of acres of CO2 going into the air compared to a minuscule part that these ethanol plants are emitting. I mean, it's like 2/100ths of 1 square mile going up into the air, and we're all breathing so far. I mean, it just doesn't make a lot of sense to me. So let's find a definition. Why and who decided that this is a good idea? And the final thing is that if it's really such a bad thing, the ethanol plants have railroad cars going right up to their plant site. They already have the technology in place to capture it. If it's such a great deal, stuff it in those railroad cars and move it wherever you want to instead of messing around with people's land. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else? Okay. Seeing none, looking for a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Been moved and properly seconded. All in favor? Aye. All opposed? All right, thanks, guys.